Thank you. And you can see the tagline that I have here is solving cyber risk. And it's not really a bold tagline, as bold as you would think. It's not saying that we're solving for zero. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about insurance is the problems that it's already solved in some areas. So an example that I'll give is maritime risk. Maritime risk in 1600s was untenable. There were shipwrecks everywhere, pirates on the high seas. You could not actually sail a ship and be like, I'm going to be okay by the end of this voyage. In the 1600s, Lloyd's of London actually went through as an insurance company and said, oh, you know what, we have data for this. We can start seeing where shipwrecks were. We know where there's some rocky coasts. Maybe we should put some light towers there. And we should talk about having steel hulls, armaments on certain ships on their cargo. And you fast forward to today, and no one says that maritime risk is unsolvable. I just got back from a cruise. It was very lovely. You don't go back and say, well, you know, I'm never going to go on a boat again. I'm not going to ship anything by cargo ever again, because there are still pirates. There are still shipwrecks. But we can by now say that maritime risk has been solved. And so when we talk about insurance in this space, it really is having a discussion about all of the risk management techniques we have at our disposal. We've heard a lot about technical things today. We've heard a lot about non-technical also, about how you merge those together to have some sort of discussion about risk management as a whole. So how do we try to address risk management? We had some really good discussions earlier. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some security metrics before I get to the one that I want to focus on for the course of the day. We also talked about cyber events. That was a really good conversation that we had earlier about how do you go through going from knowing where my assets are to what bad things could happen to them to then come up with a risk management framework that could address those things, right? So how does that really work, though? Not so well all the time, right? One of the conversations that we had yesterday was, if I'm doing so well, if everything is so green, why am I constantly reacting, right? Cybersecurity is, by its definition, has a lot of reactive elements. So we may have those best plans put forward about risk management to be able to do these proactive things, but a lot of it comes down to this reactionary nature of everything's a fire drill. And if everything's an emergency, then nothing's an emergency. If everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. How do we move forward from that? So with regards to security metrics, we had a really good discussion earlier about things that we're measuring now. We are doing better than we've ever done before on security metrics. I'm proud to report that. In my previous jobs, you may have spent a lot of money on some reporting metrics paperwork that I've done before. There's a lot of good stuff that's happening here, and we shouldn't ignore that. Unfortunately, there's an uncertainty in the evolution of metrics, right? The things that you're measuring today about your program may not, probably will not, I'll probably put a dollar down saying that it won't be, the things that you're going to measure in a year or two. Because you're going to have a better visualization of what you're doing, you're going to have a better idea of what matters when you're measuring, so your metrics have to evolve. And so when you start a metrics program, you have to start saying, well, by the way, the metrics I'm measuring today aren't going to be the same metrics. And that's not going to drive well with a lot of people. And you have to talk about the uncertainty that we have around cybersecurity as a field to get there, let alone the complexities of cybersecurity within industrial control systems to get there. And the down route ugly on security metrics is that there's a lot of subjectivity. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. We have red, yellows, and greens. We have a lot of subjectivity when we're talking about some of these things, despite our best efforts to get more hard data science into this. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about it, not all measurements are good measurements, right? So obviously I have a list of numbers here. I should just add them together, and I'll get something that makes sense. Population, foot above sea level, established in 1951. When you look at these things, you have to keep an eye as to what it is that the end goal is going to be. And do all metrics make sense for you to be measuring? You're going to carve out a metric security program as you go through. And compliance, I have found from my previous days working with Mike, going through things with NERC-CIP compliance, compliance is a good thing in a lot of cases, and you can use it to help generate better metrics than just compliance. Right? We see a lot of people now talking about beyond just being compliance enabled, being security enabled with compliance as one of those aspects. But again, metrics, by their very definition, will evolve. They will get better. And you just have to kind of, unfortunately, bear with it. So what do I really want to talk about when I'm talking about security metrics? I was going to go through a whole list of things about mean time to fix and some fancy things that we can look at for leading and lagging indicators. But what I wanted to do, what I decided to do towards the end of creating this slide deck, was give everybody in the room an actionable framework that you can use. You can go home and use what I'm going to talk about today to really help break down the silos that we see across security, linking security back to operations and finance and some of those things that we constantly hear that we don't do as security professionals. So how do we get there? How do we break down those silos? We've been seeing, for example, over the past few years, more and more risk committees stand up. So now you have somebody who's doing security, and that lead of security is meeting with the lead of finances or meeting with the lead of operations. And now they're making risk discussions together, which means that risk has to equal risk has to equal risk. I know that's redundant, but sometimes saying that you have a cybersecurity risk is not the same thing as saying you have a financial risk or an operation risk. And the terms, the metrics that they use to describe those things may not be the same things that you use to describe those things. So how do I get there? Well, one, I have to get rid of red, yellows, and greens. Red, yellows, and greens are good if they're green. If they're not green, then they're bad or something uncertain. But you're not going to find those type of conversations happening at a CFO level, right? We're talking about that, well, I have this Dow Jones Industrial type of graph that I talk about what I'm going to do last quarter or what I'm doing next quarter and how my revenue streams are going to change. What type of cyber risk are you looking at? Excellent. So once we patch our systems this week, this month, this year, how much less cybersecurity risk do I have as a result of that? Well, I was green, and now I'm green again. You have to be able to move that dialogue around in the same language that they're talking. It's unfortunately a thing that we've been getting, we struggled with at the beginning. We're doing a lot better now. The joke that I've been using is kind of showing up to crayons to a math test when you're just talking about red, yellows, and greens, but there are more sophisticated metrics being used by operations or by finances because they've been doing this for a lot longer. They've had time to evolve those metrics. As I said before, the things that we're measuring now are not going to be the same things we're measuring in the future. They've had time to evolve those metrics. And so part of this discussion is how to have a meaningful dialogue around risk. So this is one of my worst graphics I have because I just scanned this out of a book. So I'll tell you when the second one pops up, but I'm pretty sure you're going to know it. This is actually from Jack Jones's book, Measuring and Managing Information Risk. And this is talking about how to quantify cybersecurity risk in dollars. So that's one thing that we know that finances and operations talk about, dollars. It's one thing that we don't want to talk about because we always get wrapped back into the conversation we had 5 or 10 years ago about, well, there's no ROI on cybersecurity. There isn't, but there is a way to value the impact that you may have from loss of your systems that's especially relevant when we're talking about ICS. So within this metric, within this discussion point, we have to do a little bit of framing. And so this is what I'm going to give you as just a freebie. You can work with Excel toolkits all you like if you want to do that, but I'm going to give you some of those tools that you can have to make sure that risk equals risk, that you're talking about impact in those same manners. So for this discussion, we're going to talk about 4 quadrants. Within the upper row, we're talking about financial damages, things that we actually know and can quantify pretty well and historically have done. First-party damages, so the finances, the things that come out of your wallet during a cybersecurity incident. Third-party damages, the thing that comes out of somebody else's wallet or that you have to pay out to somebody to take care of their cybersecurity risks. And then the new things, the things that is not new to us, but has been new to the world at large, is the physical damage due to cybersecurity incident. So first party, what things did I have lost as a result? What destruction have I had? What environmental damages do I have? And then third party. So any suppliers or partners that you work with that may have lost equipment as a result of that too. So we have to shift our conversation as security professionals to find that inner accountant because I do need to get dollar values at the end of this. So how do I go about doing that? I talk about target first, because everybody loves target. It's not really a relevant conversation for us, but it talks about that first row, right? It talks about the financial damages. And actually, when I talk about target, I don't even care about the numbers that I see on the screen here, except for the smallest numbers on there, the numbers 2 and the number 7, right? Number 2 is how many C-suite executives lost their job as a result of the target experience. Number 7 were how many directors were found to be negligent in their fiduciary duties and were ousted, right? This brought cybersecurity to the forefront to boards for the first time ever. So now that CFO and that operations officer, if you can talk about this thing in dollars, is suddenly very interested because number 2 and number 7 are very important. So what does it look like for that first row, that financial damages? These are the things that during a cybersecurity incident you could expect to pay out on. Response costs, forensics, notifications, if you're worried about credit cards, legal expenses, PR, lost revenues, right? And also the cost of restoring lost data. Also, that can come out of your pocket. One of our partners takes care of any discussions you need to have with Bitcoin to be able to take care of ransomware demands. So what does cyber extortion expenses look like? The one thing that I'll admit is somewhat shady on here is stolen intellectual property, because I could probably give you very good values for everything in that list, but stolen IP is like, well, that's going to be $5 quadrillion because my brain is very smart and I have important things. Now, what happens when I look at third party? The list is a little bit smaller, but we are talking about the consequential revenue losses due to third parties that they'll be asking for possibly as a result of you having a cybersecurity incident, their restoration expenses, their legal expenses, as well as any crediting monitoring costs that they may suffer as a result. Now, I'm not going to waste talking about 2 and 7 on an industrial control systems example. I'm not even going to go through an industrial control system example because of my audience. Typically, I'll spend more time on this if I'm not talking to ICS professionals. We all know that bad things can happen. But what does a cyber loss spectrum look like for the actual physical damages that we may see as a result of a cybersecurity event? Mechanical breakdown, destruction or damage of property, environmental cleanup, lost revenues from physical things. So before we had lost revenue, and I'm separating this out so I can get to the adjoining conversation of insurance, but before lost revenues that may due to loss of data is very different from lost revenues due to destruction of equipment, right? If I lost some data, there is going to be some lag time in there. If I lose a giant industrial motor, I have months of lag time, potentially longer. And in some of our sectors, especially when we have some organizations and some companies that are dealing with a lot of money when you're not working properly, that adds up very, very quickly. And then also, of course, bodily injury that we may have to worry about because this is physical and real damages. Then also we'll take a look at what happens to third parties. So what happens to my suppliers, my customers, my partners that may have had equipment on site with us during this incident that could have caused additional catastrophic damages to them as well. So we have mechanical breakdown, destruction of property, environmental cleanup, and again, bodily injury. We're not so much worried about their lost revenues in some of those streams, but you could be. So why did I break it down into this discussion? Because as we discuss this a little bit more, we can now have a dollar value metric. All those things I discussed, you can find the dollar values of. You can find, if you're worried about financial damages, for example, what the average cost is for credit card monitoring. You know how much you pay for lawyers. You may have an idea of how much you would pay for a forensics team to come on site to be able to help you restore and recover. You definitely know how much, because of your property insurance, the actual assets cost. So everything that we ran through actually has a dollar value that you can find, that you can look up. And next thing you know, within this 4 quadrants, you have a good idea of where you could spend money during an actual bad incident. You go through what we discussed earlier, which was designing a scenario around those, for what does that no good, downright rotten day, that extreme yet plausible event look like? So you can start adding those values together. Why would I want to do that? Here comes the worst segue in the world. Insurance. Now, I want you to suspend your disbelief for a little moment, because some of you probably already dealt with cyber insurance in some way, shape, or form. Maybe you're on a 1-hour call for underwriting with your risk manager, and they asked you within 1 hour all the questions they could possibly need to know to underwrite you a $100 million policy. I'm sure that was a fun experience. I also want you to put aside any stories you may have heard about insurance companies not paying out on claim data. That's simply not true, and I've actually been seeing more and more claim data come out for industrial control systems type of events, which we'll get to in a little bit. So there are things that are happening in this space that are in positive movement going forward. And in these cases, if you can break down where you may have incident costs be occurring during a bad scenario, you may be able to find ways of getting financial assistance during an incident that you wouldn't otherwise have with other controls. So this is my second bad graphic. This is a rough timeline of what we could see in the control system space versus what cyber coverage was there. And I actually want to redo this at some point to add in when we saw more security frameworks and controls for ICS get added to this. So coverage started to appear in the 1990s, and it was very, very simple. It was taking your property insurance policy and then putting things like including cybersecurity. Coming from background at FERC, nothing bad has ever happened from just saying comma including cybersecurity. We only got the entire SIP standards out of 2 words in congressional language. This is how the policy started, though, because the property insurance world was all these engineering studies that you would do to be able to say, yes, this site is secure or this site is safe, I have sprinklers from fires, we're okay. And so obviously you should be able to do that for cyber. That was the thought at the time in the 90s. Then this legal case came up, Ingram Micro versus American Guarantee and Liability, where they actually said, well, we actually had cyber losses, and our policies were silent on whether or not it gets covered. And the court came out and said, absolutely, it is covered. And then all of a sudden, you see right down below, more robust electronic data exclusions started applying within insurance policies. So now you started seeing the insurance industry kind of reel away from that, put in more exclusions, and then, as a resulting line down later, we started adding them back in after new laws came into about. So California was the first state to have breach notifications. And then 46 other state laws were enacted shortly after that. So then new coverages started coming about. Privacy breach liability coverage, breach regulatory event expenses. So they'd pay you back for your regulatory costs during an event that required you to go through that process. So everything was starting to get their own crafted policies, their own tailor-made versions of things to address cybersecurity needs until Stuxnet hurt. And then once Stuxnet hit, everyone's like, oh no, that's a thing? Okay. Remove all of the cyber from everything. So you started seeing things that were orders of magnitude larger than you could possibly think before because they're worried about credit card breaches, they're worried about data exfiltration, not the destruction of physical property. So property and casualty insurance carriers started strengthening the exclusions even more than they were before, crafting unique policies outside of it. And now we're in this new age, to get to what Mike's point was we're going, that there are new products coming about just for ICS, just for property damages that may be incurred due to cybersecurity event. So it's almost coming full circle. They were going into property coverage and they were ripped out from property coverage, and now we're seeing new things that are being able to reenact that and reinvigorate that. So let's revisit our 4 quadrants. This is a traditional cybersecurity insurance policy, right? There's roughly 60 insurers. You can get up to maybe 200 million, maybe a little bit more of coverage for this first quadrant, with the exception of your $10 quadrillion of special intellectual property from your smart brains. Everything that we talked about would get covered, right? Whether or not you have to pay ransomware, whether or not you have to get a forensics firm on site. We've had clients that have been able to get a check within 24 hours to have a forensics firm on site to help them out. $250,000 within 24 hours. I do not know a CISO that has $250,000 just lying around for a rainy day fund to say, hey, I finally need to make that call. Insurance will help take care of that. On the third party, this is all covered, widely covered by insurance. Again, these are financial, so this is something that everybody is very familiar with. As a matter of fact, if you were to go online, you can find several magic calculators that you put in how many credit card records that you hold, and it'll say, well, you need this much insurance. I don't trust the math behind any of that, but you can do those types of things because people are very comfortable with this risk. They know what this looks like. They know what the average payout is. Now we get to the uncertain parts, right? This is all excluded from cyber policies. So I show up sometimes with utilities, with other organizations, with ICS, and they say, oh, well, we're covered. We have an ICS policy. We have a cyber policy. But they haven't talked necessarily to their ICS security team, where all the risk is actually being managed. So they may have a policy, but guess what? It covers all the credit card and social security numbers, so those 3,000 employees will get credit monitoring, but you have a giant hole in the ground, so I don't know what to do about that. What we have been seeing, though, on a positive note, is there is some uncertainty. And this is one of the things where I told you before that you'd want to wear your accountant hat. This is actually, you may need a JD at this point. This is reading actual policies because some property insurance policies are silent on cybersecurity. So they may cover it, they may not. To make matters worse, depending on where you got your policy, depending on what court you have to go to, depending on what market you're in, that may change too. You have some courts and some markets that lean towards the buyer side, some that lean towards the insurer side in terms of where the claim gets processed. There are other exclusions that do apply here. Terrorism, electronic data, things like bricking are actually a huge conundrum within the insurance world of how to try to solve that, because the device is fine, it just doesn't turn on, but the device is still there. There's a lot of different things that esoterically go on when talking to lawyers about insurance policies. The good news is, as of the past 2 or 3 years, you can now get products that will cover all of that. You can get special buyback policies that will just take care of, oh, I know what your property insurance is. Let's do another engineering study or another discussion around what security controls you have in place for ICS, and let's say where I'm comfortable at transferring that risk over to me to be able to give you some sort of buyback, some sort of insurance coverage for a cybersecurity event. Unfortunately, I've got some cyber coverage that covers the third-party pieces. I have some that absolutely does not, and I have some that is absolutely uncertain. Unfortunately, this part, the first part's really easy. We can get all those numbers. We can get an Excel spreadsheet. We can put that together. This second part requires a little bit more reading policy language that I know everybody has a lot of time to do and really loves to do. But those are the next parts of what you would look at, because what you eventually want to get to is that exact same discussion, that exact same metric of where are my impacts, and then say, okay, but I'm covered here. I have some insurance products here. The insurance, most times, when I show up on site and have these discussions, is being bought. A lot of people are buying cyber insurance because the broker is going to the risk manager and saying, you know, you should get some cyber insurance because cyber is a thing. Have you heard of Target? 2 and 7, very scary. In those cases, they're buying insurance, but it may not be addressing your cyber risk, right? Especially if you're not in that conversation, then I guarantee that it's probably not happening, because you're not going to find that many risk managers who may be proactively going out there and saying, you know, I need to educate myself as to what security controls we have in place. And I can obviously just do that by reading a couple books online. Even if they do that, they're not going to get your risk right. They're not going to be doing these types of equations necessarily. They can do it a lot easier with the property pieces, but the cybersecurity pieces are a lot more difficult, as we know. So, why should you be viewing cybersecurity as an insurance, as an incentive? In this case, it's the only control, either technical or not technical, that will pay for itself during an incident. Like I said, within 24 hours, you can get a check. You can get teams on the floor that you don't have necessarily in-house. They'll also take care of lost revenue in a lot of cases as well. It's also one of the few controls, and I don't want to say the only control, but one of the few controls that what we would say would provide you with exculpability, whether as a security leader or as a CISO. Because you can say, after doing an exercise like this, I know what my cybersecurity impacts are. I know where my risks are. I know the quantification of my risk. I know what my security program does. I know where my strengths and weaknesses are. I know how mature or not mature I am. And oh, by the way, just in case something really, really bad does happen, we're covered. We got this. The safety net, the under-frequency load shedding is able to be taken care of. We are not going to completely go under as a result of this. And it's one of those controls, too, that as you implement it, it gets cheaper. It's not something that necessarily you'll get the pocket money of, because the person who buys risk is typically not within the security department, so that budget probably still gets spent somewhere else. But the company itself will have lower deductibles, will have an easier time of getting insurance as security matures and gets better. And so notionally, if I were to take what cybersecurity risk looks like and I start adding controls and capabilities to there becomes a point in time when the investment in technology becomes too complex or too overburdensome, or I can only do so much with the budget that I have. In which case, you may want to start looking at transferring that risk over to an insurance company, maybe self-insuring. There's a lot of people who do that too, depending on how big your assets are. And it notably decreases your risk, right? Because it's doing that payback function. It's covering those things that the technical controls can't. And so over time, you can find your risk decreasing as a result. And then brings you back to the boardroom, to the risk committee, to the discussion of, with the CFO, with the COO, the people who do finances operations, what is my cyber risk? Are we managing it? Once I do all these patches you say I have to do, will I be better or worse? How much more do you need? What more money do you need? Where are you putting your resources? You can have those conversations with the same dialogue and in the same terms, especially if you start using the dollars as opposed to the red, yellows, and greens. And with that, I'll open it to questions.
Very good. I thought this was an important talk to have here and an education, because there has been change. And with your engagement, I've been very impressed with how insurance companies have been thinking about this problem. A couple things real quickly. And I think recently, if you look at the Yahoo sale, right? So putting a value on cyber, the sale price went down significantly. And then on top, because of that, penalties back to the CEO lost her bonus, right? Yep. So I think, obviously, I think you have more C people paying attention to this than ever before. Real quick question for you, or I guess maybe an illustration of an important point you're making. I worked for a large integrated utility, and we actually had an accident, and we just got the initial notifications that we threw some turbine blades, we lost a turbine, and the immediate first thing out of somebody's mouth was, well, there's a $25 million problem. And the answer was not even close, right? Even though the thing cost $25 billion, we have a concept in power generation called commercial availability. Every unit has a factor. It needs to be commercially available so much because that's the value of the power that it produces that we can schedule into the market depending on what market you lived in. But more importantly, what was more important than that, I remember that I was with the senior vice president in charge of risk at the time, just said, I need to know what plant now, right? Because we knew in our heads which ones had firm power contracts. Right. And if you had firm fixed pricing, you had to buy replacement power. And if we had negotiated that 2 years ago and we were providing firm fixed pricing, if we lost a certain turbine, it could be a $700 million problem versus a $25 million problem. So doing the math you're talking about in the 4 quadrants and using that language, I think, is a powerful tool. So onto a question, I guess. Sorry. Let me talk about a case for investment. Are the insurance industry getting to a point, especially with this real property coverage without these exclusions, where when they do conduct an evaluation of security, whether that's an interview-based thing, I know they're toying with different instruments, are you seeing very real price reductions and larger total coverages based on good security programs? Yes. Meaning you can actually start putting a value on your security investments because you can say our pricing's better and our coverage is better.
Yeah, so I've been lucky enough to actually be part of beyond just those phone interviews of, hey, so you have a DCS, I hear. What do you do with that? To actually doing on-site engineering studies. And in those cases where we've done those, we've actually seen people going back to the market and getting higher limits as a result of those engineering studies and due diligence compared to just doing the typical underwriting process. So people who show the due diligence and people who show an interest and they tie in the security team to the process do remarkably better in the marketplace.
Right. So you could actually start justifying your control system security investments in, hey, we're able to do it at this one site, and that allowed us, based on that coverage, to receive this much back in this much additional coverage. All right, lots of questions. We're going to have to answer these probably pretty quickly. Have there been recorded cases of cyber insurance fraud?
I would not have that data. That would be a great conversation for an insurer that I'm not sure if they would say yes or no on. With the ICS component, I think the difficulty on that, and it's funny because we had this debate earlier today about the BTC pipeline, for example. If the BTC pipeline issue was an insurable event, and you said, oh, this wasn't cyber, okay, property insurance, go. And then you say, wait, no, it is cyber. Property insurance would be like, wait, I need my money back, and you don't have your insurance over here for cyber. And then a year later, after the Bloomberg article, it's like, oh, but it wasn't cyber after all. I mean, so those same conversations have to happen, and the difficulty on ICS, as we know, is that the asset isn't there anymore. That makes the conversation, the investigation, a lot more difficult.
So what's interesting, though, is also insurance companies, if they do have real property coverage and they don't have the right exclusions, they're actually incentivized to conduct an investigation to determine whether it's cyber or not.
Yes, absolutely. So and they will do a lot of due diligence on that, right?
So we need to go to the cyber insurance industry to see how they're doing that. So are you, are you seeing anything from the insurance industry as relates to nation state attackers and being an exclusion from, from coverage, right? Because we sit there and say, oh boy, a company should only really deal with these things. This is an entire country. How could you do that? Our insurance industry trying to write exclusions for nation state types of the type of actor.
Active war is always excluded, right? And so I think the conversation there is what is an active war and how does that get defined? And there are additional roadblocks in the way, in case anybody hasn't heard of TRIA, which deals with terrorism in particular. And so in those cases, there are some stopgaps that allow either more insurance money to come in and other exclusions apply. But don't get too excited because for TRIA to be enacted, of all secretaries in the U.S. government that would say it's a terrorism event, it's the Secretary of Treasury, which I haven't heard that be declared. It hasn't been declared in any of his conversations. But so it's different than DHS or FBI having those conversations.
Interesting policy implication,
isn't it?
Right?
Yeah,
so, absolutely. Okay, so what are the leading and lagging indicators for cyber insurance? Are there any lead and lag indicators?
Yeah, so there aren't going to be very many leading indicators. A lot of insurance companies have been doing a lot more on threat monitoring than I think I've seen ever before in the past year or two in particular. And so I think that they're going through those efforts of creating those metrics. And they also, because you're transferring the risk to them, they want to be proactive about that, and they want to be able to be partners in that. Because I know a lot of people, everybody wants another partner in their security regime. But they do, because they're transferring that risk over to them. They're going to be out of pocket money. So they'll do the best things that they can possibly do to make sure that you actually won't have an incident. And some of that does take care of looking at those indicators and having those conversations with you. As appropriate.
Yeah, it's a great question. From one of the difficulties we had in the oil and gas industry with tying losses, financial value, to suffering loss of life was the PR nightmare that comes with the company declaring the value of a human life. Now, if you're in the nuclear sector, you're lucky because the regulator does it for you.
Already has a table.
Right? NRC has a table that says a human life is worth $3 million, right?
Yes.
At least it's a point that the regulator saved. I can see how some folks you put that down and you start doing calculations, and then that becomes this PR nightmare when it gets out.
So the great thing about the what I just put up there, you can do this in an Excel spreadsheet. You can do this with gigantic ranges. You could also be very, very aggressive and do Monte Carlo simulations until you're blue in the face. So if you want to come down to like the percent value, you could do that. I wouldn't recommend that though. But if you have a large range that says, well, this could be anywhere between, I don't know, a couple of thousand to a couple of million. It's not going to be as accurate for your insurance purposes, but that may soften the blow.
I want to see your description table on that. Adolf Hitler, $0. Mother Teresa, somewhere up here.
And you also see bodily injury. You know, you can move yourself from the loss of life in that way too.
Okay.
Lawyers,
we'll just
very
take
smart people.
In the middle there. Okay. Can you use the cost from natural disasters such as Hurricane Sandy to determine the cost of physical damage that might occur from a cyber attack?
Absolutely. Now, that's what the property insurance world does, right? So the property insurance world, they say that we are going to underwrite the property of this power plant or of this oil and natural gas facility. There's a lot of engineering studies that go into it. I mean, weeks, months of studies. And so when they look at whether or not a cyber event could have those catastrophic damages, it's just considered a buyback at that point. They say, yes, we're just going to assume that what was in that property insurance is something that it can be lost.
But it's important to note that in doing some of these studies, the U.S. government invested in the NESAC, right? DHS has funded the NESAC, several national laboratories using physics models to determine what consequences might look like. Very good, particularly for weather hazards and different types where we understand the physics model.
Yeah, so I'll say yes to the physical damages, no to the systemic impacts.
Right, I agree with that.
Because the systemic impacts would be, I've just lost the entire Northeast. Why did I lose the entire Northeast? Because I've seen a blackout that has lost the entire Northeast.
Right, I agree
that may not be the systemic model that we'd be looking at.
And what I was going to suggest is a lot of these things are predicated on damage profiles. So for example, in a hurricane, when you talk about high wind damage, you're talking about shearing poles, knocking them over, losing lines. And the recovery capability for putting up wooden poles is very fast. And then when you talk about the cyber damage, it's a very different profile. We're out of an experienced space. We haven't replaced transformers very quickly, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Is the pricing for cyber policy sustainable, i.e., do the insurer property assets assess their risks? And if there is risks that the insurers will simply not pay for, if large claims are made, meaning can they get themselves in trouble where they'll go default or just say we're not paying that? And what's interesting about cyber, and this is a great question, because there's something what's called shared or horizontal risk, meaning I'm going to cover this power company over here, that power company over there, that power company over there, and then you find a horizontal thing that links them all together. One large thing's happened, and now you've exposed yourself to the entire family of risks by having probabilistic failure at any individual utility.
Yes, and so you will find, and there are cases, so when you create something that will cover your realm of losses, you create what's called a tower of insurance. So there's somebody at the very bottom who pays first, and somebody pays after that, and so you just construct a tower as large as you want.
And the penthouse is called the United States government.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, actually, at the very top, you might find people who say, you know what, I'll be at the very top of your tower because it may be some of the cheapest insurance, and I don't expect you to ever get to me. But it may be a huge amount at the top of the tower. And so we've actually have seen people who've been at the very top, and you've had a scenario that has expelled the entire tower down, and now this one company at the top just lost their entire budget. Like, it was their entire operating cost. They were done. So in that case, they went to court. They did try to fight that. I believe they lost, if I recall in particular for that case. So yes, if you're going to bankrupt an insurance company, expect that there will be a court battle. So probably work with your risk manager to not do that.
Okay. Is the insurance industry looking for key indicators of meeting some type of a standard to give you pricing? And I'll give you an example. There's legislation that's called the Safety Act. The Department of Homeland Security has a program that evaluates your infrastructure and the security things that you're putting into place, and then they'll actually certify you at different levels, right? In fact, that started with stadiums and large events, right? You had the Super Bowl, and they could do that, and that provided some relief or benefit relative to liability. Yep. But it's also a measure that somebody had a process for in measuring. So has the insurance industry recognized things like the Safety Act and Safety Act certified as maybe a tool to help them with pricing? Have you seen any of that? Do you see anything like that exist in other countries as well? Anything in Europe or Asia?
So there's a lot of insurance companies out there, and they all have their own relative level of maturity, not just in cyber, but in insurance underwriting in general. And so there are some that I would say that if you told them about what compliance regime you go to, will have a very clear understanding of what their next question should be, and that will help them with the pricing and figuring out what your limit should be. There are others who absolutely would not have an idea of what that would mean. So it's a mixed bag. It's a yes and a no. I do know that some that are looking at safety. I know some that are looking at whether or not you have a conversation about SIP, whether or not you're in finances, you talk about PCI, that they know what to drag out and have a deeper conversation about, but that's not by far the norm. Those are outliers who are very progressive in wanting to understand the risk and insure it appropriately.
Okay. Before my next question, I just want you to realize, and hopefully Brian picked this up, but we're doing the meme thing up here. You did state how big are my assets. I just want you quoted that. I just wanted to. All right. How are the break glass response teams, forensics folks, when insurance payouts turn around 24 hours? It's an interesting thing that this has happened to me because, how do you declare that you need that level of response?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how many times when I was a director of an ISAC, people called me up and said, "Oh my God, I got a problem. I think that the Chinese are here." And then I'd be like, "Well, first of all, I couldn't even traffic. Let me walk you through how you might capture some traffic. Let's look at that." And you go, "You have a misconfigured switch. Thank you." So if you got the big check rolls in, you're excited. You cash it. You run around. You got people flying in. And then the second piece of that is how do you vet this forensic response force you buy 24 hours later and you start letting them touch all your assets? Have you seen these things? Have you been part of this?
So there are, because you're dealing with an insurance policy, you're dealing with lawyers, you're dealing with financial teams, there are checks and balances throughout that to when that trigger would actually happen. Vetting it, they have preferred partners, just like anybody else. So, for example, we're one of the preferred partners for AIG. We're part of 4 other firms that do different work for cybersecurity insurance and what that looks like, and they have a forensics firm. They have a firm that's dedicated to getting you the bitcoins you need for ransomware. And so they all have preferred partners that they vet so that within 24 hours you're not freaking out about meeting all the criteria to get your claims. Then you say, oh, well, I also need to try and call my best buddy.
They actually become they have partner service providers, right?
Exactly.
So it's actually, you get a benefit there. So somebody asked the question, I don't understand my risks other than the basic PII risk. How do I figure it out, and how do I communicate that to my C-suite? So you've given us some tools.
Yeah.
So, but how do I figure out, that's a daunting task.
It is a daunting task. I've been with people who can do that with a dedicated conference room and the right people in the room, march through those categories, and get something on the board within a day. Now, you'll refine that over weeks or months, but you can start having the conversation of, well, what do legal fees look like? Well, what do I pay for a lawyer? What would regulatory fines look like? Well, do I have any regulatory regimes that I'm worried about? You can start slowly piecing that together. I would recommend taking it just one of those quadrants at a time, and you can really just start piece-throughing one by one. And it does look daunting at first, but by the time you're done with it, you can get to those graphs that tell you what's my dollar value.
Okay, the big idea, I've been holding this for like 4 months waiting for the summit. I would like all you guys to go out there, you think about it. I always think about what can I do in my contracting security program, right? A lot of us are very reliant on third parties, either providing maintenance or services, or maybe even doing the facility management for us, right? So think about this. When you write that contract next time, and if you've seen this yet, I'd be really interested to see if you've seen this. The part of the contract requirement is a certain level of
Insurance.
real cyber, real property coverage.
Right.
Because, look, if somebody comes in and attacks my data center through my HVAC system, I want that HVAC system provider to have enough insurance to know that I'm going to get a good response so I can get that data center back online, right?
Right.
Have you seen
I
any of
haven't
that?
seen that, but it's interesting because
Go out there and do
going
this.
and doing contracting, there are times that you have to show up on site with some sort of personal safety insurance, right? To be able to say that I have a certificate of insurance that says if anything happens to me on your site, I'm okay. You don't have to worry about me. My insurance will worry about me. It is a hop, skip, and a jump away. I would hope that we can get to having that with cyber.
We got through all these questions.
Woo!
Awesome. All right, thank you so much.
All right.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.